This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
What's at issue is the American experiment with these truths enumerated in the Declaration of Independence. That all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. The history of the United States is a history of contradiction, conquest, sovereignty, tyranny, freedom. Everything is in play almost all the time. It was an attempt at a more perfect union. It was an ongoing proposition. I mean, one was expected to tinker with it. I mean, it's a joining of an organism and a mechanism. It's trying to balance a democratic society that puts a premium on equality with a capitalist economy that doesn't. But it requires constant attention.
And it has been constantly reshaped and reformed. It isn't written in stone. It's not engraved in metal. It is a parchment barrier, as Madison called it, and it is inadequate. I mean, it obviously it sanctioned slavery. It's just the fatal flaw of the document that led to 750,000 deaths in the Civil War and to the endurance and suffering of millions of enslaved people for decades after its ratification.
What's extraordinary in those speeches that Lincoln gave on the eve of the war is his realization of how diverse America had become. And the idea of a nation means a tribe, a single ethnicity. And here's this United States with, as Lincoln says, we've got Frenchmen, we've got Spaniards, we've got Germans, we've got Irish, we've got all these different Scots. How are we going to hold together? We're not a nation. And that's a concern that people have increasingly through the period, the antebellum period. And Lincoln says, well, we have an answer to that. And it's that good old, he says, that good old Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And he says, and this is true for all men in all times. And then he says, all these immigrants who came here have a bond with the founders. And then he goes on with an image which I find still startling. He says, as if they are flesh of the flesh and blood of the founders. Well, that's just an extraordinary statement which helps explain why these founders still have some meaning for us. He's saying that declaration that they created, that Declaration of Independence, is what gives them a kind of blood relationship to everybody who comes after, even if they have no actual blood relationship with the people. And therefore, a nation like ours, which is not really a nation, can be held together as a single people, as one people.
I'm Donovan Hone, and this is the first episode of Lapham's Revolutionary America, a special series of The World in Time brought to you by the editorial team at Lapham's Quarterly. In a sense, we at Lapham's Quarterly have been commemorating America since last summer, when we launched our intermittent and ongoing series on Moby Dick, that classic, tragic, prophetic, epic, essayistic, and deeply American novel. Like our series on Moby Dick, Lapham's Revolutionary America will be intermittent and ongoing. But we are beginning the series with 2 episodes. This one and a second we'll be sharing next week. When he was hosting The World in Time, Lewis Lapham recorded many conversations with historians and scholars of America's Revolutionary period. And this series will draw from those archival conversations. Occasionally, we'll be complementing them with new conversations. Each episode will be a kind of audio anthology, bringing together the voices of the past and the voices of the present, the voices of both the dead and the living. The voices you'll hear won't always harmonize. Alongside the podcast, we'll be publishing readings on our website, laphamsquarterly.org. We won't be strictly constrained chronologically to the Revolutionary period. We may at times point the dowsing rod backward toward the colonial period, seeking sources, or we may follow the currents downstream a bit to the antebellum period, or even to the present. In most cases, we'll just be excerpting the conversations that Lewis Lapham recorded, but for today's episode, we're presenting one archival conversation in its entirety, a conversation that the late Lewis Lapham recorded with the late American historian Gordon S. Wood. We had just begun work on today's episode when news came on June 7th, 2026, that Gordon S. Wood had died at age 92. A professor of history for many years at Brown University, Wood was the author of numerous acclaimed histories of revolutionary America, including The Creation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1787, which won the Bancroft Prize, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, which won the Pulitzer Prize, Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, 1789 to 1815, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, which he discussed with Lewis H. Lapham on the December 8th, 2017 episode of The World in Time. That is the conversation that, in commemoration of Gordon S. Wood, this episode will present again in its entirety. And the episode will conclude with an audio version of a reading we'll be publishing on our website, an essay adapted from the foreword Gordon S. Wood wrote for Ted Widmer's new book, The Living Declaration, a biography of America's founding text. Normally, we'd reserve audio versions of readings for subscribers to our Substack, who have access to ad-free, unabridged episodes of The World in Time. But we'll be keeping this audio version of Wood's final word on the Declaration of Independence available to all. The other voice you'll hear in today's episode, along with the voices of Lewis H. Lapham and Gordon S. Wood, is the voice of Jill Lepore, professor at Harvard and longtime contributor to The New Yorker, who spoke with Lewis Lapham in 2018 about These Truths, Lepore's grand, sweeping, single-volume history of the United States. Although Lepore's latest book, published last year, titled We the People, is a history of the U.S. Constitution, These Truths spans 5 centuries, beginning in 1492 and ending in 2016. It is not a history of the Revolutionary period, but it encompasses the Revolutionary period, and the part of Lepore's conversation with Lapham about the Revolutionary period provides, we hope, an introduction and overture for the series of conversations to follow. So we begin there with Jill Lepore and Lewis H. Lapham.
It's a wonderful book, Jill, as enlightening as it is timely. Your book asks how the course of American history from 1492 to the present aligns or doesn't align with its founding truths. You give us a long book, 932 pages, all of them readable, wonderfully readable, a narrative history the likes of which hasn't been published in this country for a long time, meant to double as an old-fashioned civics book. Maybe you can begin with the issue of the New York Packet for October 30th, 1787.
Sure. I chose to start the book with the story of that issue of that lovely little newspaper, the New York Packet, because it encapsulates the ambition of the book, really, which is to transport us back in time and fully reckon with the archival historical record and its richness and its fullness in its complexity, the beauty and the tragedy. So in that issue of the New York Packet, beautiful little 4-page, 2-sheet newspaper, there are a number of things that you find all glommed together, higgledy-piggledy, like those 18th century newspapers always were. On the one hand, there's on the front page an advertisement for a new almanac. It's the kind of getting close to the end of the year. The printers are selling an almanac for the new year, 1788, with all the things farmers would want to know. But you can buy that almanac with or without a copy of the new Constitution, which is hot off the presses, just been finalized in Philadelphia a few weeks before. Americans were, eager to read it and weigh in on the debate about ratification. And then also in that issue of the New York Packet is the first of the Federalist Papers, Federalist Number 1, published anonymously, of course, but was written by Alexander Hamilton, in which Hamilton asks a question that, in my mind, really is the question of American history. He says, it has fallen to the people of the United States to decide this important question, whether people can live according to reason and choice, or whether they are fated, like all other peoples in the history of the world, to live according to accident and force, and that this is the Constitution that Americans should ratify in order to try to answer that question. And just on the next page of the issue, of the same issue of the New York Packet, is an advertisement for a Negro wench, as the advertisement would have said, for sale with a 6-month-old male infant who's still nursing at her breast. You can go to the printer shop, the same printer shop, where you can pick up your new copy of the Constitution and make a bid to buy a piece of human property. So I start there because all the beauty and the tragedy of American history can be found in those 4 pages of a single issue of a New York City newspaper.
The Constitution, the letter from Hamilton, and the advertisement for a Negro wench with a nursing baby. And that contradiction is still with us.
It is absolutely still with us. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is that people are, I think, continually remarking on the suddenness of social movements or forms of political protest. We have a very limited sense of the past. We live in a kind of prison of the present, and that Hamilton, Federalist One, Constitution, slave ad juxtaposition was my way of trying to jostle the reader into the kind of reality of the lived past, its similarities and its differences, its distance in time from us, and also its nearness morally.
Yes, and you go through the history of the United States is a history of contradiction, conquest, sovereignty, tyranny, freedom. That everything is in play almost all the time.
Yeah, and what's tricky about doing that narratively is that a lot of historical work that's written for the public is pretty polemical and didactic, and it'll be kind of one or the other. So there'll either be a book of sort of American triumphalism, the greatness of the American experiment, or there'll be a book about kind of the litany of American atrocities.
Right. And
they map ideologically on to kind of extreme partisan positions, but neither of them is a true accounting. And neither of them is actually very useful. They each advance a political agenda, but they do nothing in terms of fostering a civic spirit or engagement with the past at the level of evidence and reasoning and inquiry. So I was trying to reject the sort of America's horrible, America's great model of the American past and try to ask the reader kind of undertake a journey with me as an investigation into that complexity it's an uneasy path, but to just hold to that path the whole way through.
But that's what's so wonderful about it, because you give us what I think Eric Foner called a usable past. The trouble with the polemical histories are that they are not complex, ambiguous. What can I learn from it? You ask the question somewhere in the book, what does history teach? And what does history teach?
I think history mostly teaches humility. I think the idea that we sit in a position of moral superiority over the dead is bizarre. I think wrestling with the past and watching people wrestle with the moral and ethical and political complexities of their own day is quite chastening. I think chastening is a useful experience.
Yes. And the founders, or the framers, they were all students of history. They find their ideas ancient authors and authors of the 18th century Enlightenment and 17th century and the Holy Bible. They exploit the resources of history as actively as some other Americans exploit the wilderness.
Absolutely. Benjamin Franklin writes about, he takes notes on his readings on history from the very young man. Madison is forever buying books, collecting works of political history as well as political philosophy. What they're really trying to do is to examine, they're empiricists, they're Enlightenment empiricists, and they believe the historical record is a body of evidence that can be consulted the way a natural scientist, a natural philosopher might conduct experiments. Here's all the experiments in the history of government exist and can be consulted and conferred with. So if you're going to design a new experiment, you want to learn from the lessons of the past. So we happen to be at a moment now, as you said in your opening remarks, in which there's a lot of reason to really be concerned about the sustainability of our form of government. And instead of looking to the past or trying to understand turns in American history or in the history of other countries that might inform some good decision-making and a kind of reckoning with what might structurally be going on, we just kind of look around the horizon and try to find people to blame. And it's just not instructive, and it's really not in the spirit, frankly, of a Republican form of government in which we are actually supposed to be collectively dedicated to a continuing inquiry into, is this system of government actually working? Is it meeting the objectives of a government that is meant to make it possible for us to live justly and as equals according to the exercise of reason and choice, and not to the experience of accident and force? That is, Hamilton's question is one we are actually supposed to be asking as citizens, each of us, all the time.
And that's the way the framers thought of the Constitution. I mean, it was an attempt at a more perfect union. It was an ongoing proposition. I mean, one was expected to tinker with it. I mean, it's a joining of an organism and a mechanism. It's trying to balance a democratic society that puts a premium on equality with a capitalist economy that doesn't. But it requires constant attention.
And it has been constantly reshaped and reformed. It isn't written in stone. It's not engraved in metal. It is a parchment barrier, as Madison called it, and it is inadequate. I mean, it obviously it sanctioned slavery. It's just the fatal flaw of the document that led to 750,000 deaths in the Civil War and to the endurance and suffering of millions of enslaved people for decades after its ratification. The Constitution also has no concept of the idea that women exist in public life. It is an agreement among men to govern, to consent to be governed. It is the reign of men over women remains in the private sphere. So there are ways in which the Constitution from its start includes, both its tremendous promise, but also, is blinded to the forms of inequality that we pay so much attention to now and have struggled to amend the Constitution in ways that make it possible to address those limitations and its original blind spots, and to struggle over the meaning of the Constitution.
You talk about, again, speaking about women, you talk about the first half of the 19th century and what was called the Second Great Awakening, a religious revival in the country. And women are very prominent in that movement, and they're very prominent in refashioning the idea of a republic, which is the one the founders had in mind, toward a democracy, which is the one that... And this is, you have some marvelous... I can't remember them, but maybe if you can quote, there's a wonderful black woman in Boston who truly eloquent.
Yeah.
And this is early. This is 1830.
Yeah. it's so fascinating to look at how women respond to being left out of the Constitution, to being left out of the public sphere of the new republic. And when I was working on the book, I tried to choose characters who could embody whole movements or whole strains of thought. And I chose this woman, Maria Stuart, who's born free in New York in, I think, 1804. And in the 1820s, she's born again, swept up in this evangelical revival known as the Second Great Awakening, as were many women, more women than men, and as were many free blacks. Maria Stuart is a free black woman who married a free black man in Boston. And she took that spirit of evangelical Christianity and applied it to her reading of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
Yes, right.
Remember, it's the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1826. It's the Jubilee. It's much celebrated. There's a lot of attention to the Declaration of Independence in 1826. And Maria Stuart is one of many evangelical Christians who insists on taking, the equality that Jefferson talks about in the Declaration of Independence. She takes it in as this Christian equality of all souls in the eyes of God, men and women, male and female, black and white, all peoples are equal in the eyes of God. And that is how she reads the Declaration of Independence, and therefore black women are equal to all other people. And she insists that in addition to being equal, she has a right and an obligation, in fact, to make that clear to her fellow citizens. And she marches down to the offices of the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, and, walks into the printing room and says to him, he's the editor of the paper, I would like to write for your newspaper. I have things to say. He creates this little ladies' department for her, but she writes these incredibly compelling essays about equal rights, about abolition, calling for an immediate, she's a radical abolitionist, and about women's equal rights. And she's the first woman in the United States to speak before what's called a mixed audience, that is an audience of both men and women. It was considered not polite for a woman to speak to men in public. And it also speaks to an audience of both blacks and whites. This is quite a stunning, radical woman. And she then is essentially, in the middle of the 1830s, kind of shut up. I mean, she's considered kind of too radical. And the only reason we know as much about her as we do, obviously her essays were published and those survive, but her husband had served in the War of 1812 as a sailor. And after he dies, she files an application for a pension as a veteran's widow. And William Lloyd Garrison writes a statement. She needs like a character witness to say, I know this person. I can say this is indeed Maria Stuart. She was indeed married to James Stuart. And she's a very deserving widow. And he tells the story about the day that she showed up at the office of the Liberator, which allows me, decades and decades later to animate her on a page, which is really, really important because we don't know enough about women like her. She just happens to kind of survive as a character because Garrison had to write this kind of character testament about her. But she illuminates so much about reform, about women's use of their moral authority, to make political demands upon men while themselves denied the right to participate politically, which prefigures so much in later American history.
That was Jill Lepore speaking with Louis Lapham in 2018 about her book, These Truths, A History of the United States. We'll be publishing on our website, as a companion to Lapham's Revolutionary America, an excerpt from an essay by Maria W. Stuart, from which Lepore quotes in These Truths. Stuart's essay was originally published by William Lloyd Garrison and collected in Meditations from the pen of Mrs. Maria W. Stuart, widow of the late James W. Stuart, now matron of the Freedmen's Hospital, and presented in 1832 to the First African Baptist Church and Society of Boston, Massachusetts. And now, here's the conversation that Louis Lapham recorded with Gordon S. Wood in 2017 about Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
You tell a story, Gordon, of the 50-year friendship maintained by John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And by so doing, you have written an extraordinarily fine book about the founding of the American government and the meaning of the American idea. Why don't we begin where you begin the book with the end of the story, and then we can go back to the beginning, and we begin with the chapter you call the eulogies.
It's the Jubilee celebration. That is the 50th anniversary of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, which coincided with the death of two of the signers, and in fact on the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. So it was such a coincidence that it seemed to the American people to be providential.
I mean, that Jefferson and Adams die on the same day, July 4th.
That's right, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the writing of the Declaration. And this seemed to be something of a miracle. Of course, there was a little bit of effort made to make that day. Jefferson asked his doctor, he knows he's dying, what day is it? And the doctor says it's July 3rd. He says, oh, well, he manages to stay alive for another day and make it perfect.
He dies in Monticello, and Adams dies in Braintree. And when Adams dies, he says he doesn't know that Jefferson has died, and he says that Jefferson survives.
Right. Of course, technically, he's wrong because Jefferson died 5 hours earlier. But in a larger symbolic sense, he's right. Jefferson goes on and survives in a way that, in our consciousness, in a way that Adams does not. Jefferson is in a very different league, a celebrity league at the time, and for us ever since. Adams simply doesn't have the kind of status in our memory that Jefferson does, and that's understandable. He's a very different kind of founder.
When do they first meet each other?
They meet at the Continental Congress, in the Second Continental Congress. Adams has been in both Continental Congresses, the first and the second, and Jefferson joins. He was ill and he couldn't make the first. He joins Adams in the second. He's younger than Adams, 8 years, and so he defers to Adams, and Adams likes that, and they are both radicals. That is to say, they're both eager for independence from Great Britain. So they become part of the vanguard pushing for the break, and it's natural that they would be assigned to the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence.
Well, let's talk about the differences between them, the what you call the contrasts. It's when they meet in Philadelphia in the Second Continental Congress. That's 1775.
1775.
They essentially are from different countries.
Exactly right. Virginia, which is the largest colony at the time, by far. I mean, Virginia dominated the group of colonies in a way that no other state ever has dominated the country. It's the richest, it's the most populous, but it's 40% of its population is enslaved, and it's dominated by planter aristocrats in a way that Massachusetts is a relatively egalitarian society, and Adams comes from a very middling sort of background, and where Jefferson is a planter of great wealth. He inherits slaves and land from his father, and then from his father-in-law when he marries. He gets more land and more slaves. So by 1770, early 70s, he is one of the wealthiest planters in all of the colony of Virginia. Adams' wealth is modest. He's not a poor man. He earns quite a bit, but he's never the rich from his legal practice. Almost everything he owns comes from legal practice. And he is not one of the wealthiest members of that Massachusetts society, something that always rankled him because he was scorned often by some of the wealthy members of the Massachusetts elite.
So they not only come from different backgrounds and different societies, they're both hierarchies, but they're of a different kind of a hierarchy. But talk about their differences in their appearance and temperament.
Well, they couldn't differ more. They're sort of a Mutt and Jeff. Of course, that dates me, but I don't know how many people know who Mutt and Jeff are. Well, but Jefferson's tall, lanky, gangling, reserved in character and temperament. Adams is short, stout. He confesses that he was but an ordinary man in appearance. His temperament is different, too. He's not, he's excitable, he's irascible. Jefferson is very self-contained, very very conscious of being polite. And I think that politeness hurts him in a way, although it's a secret of his success. It makes him, because he never says exactly what he feels about people, he never says to their face, he is often accused of being disingenuous and being two-faced. Adams has the opposite problem. He tells people what he thinks and gets himself in trouble over and over again. But once you got to know Adams, he trusts you, he could be quite amiable. Although he's always facetious, he's sarcastic, he makes jokes, and he razzes people. He razzes Jefferson all the time. And Jefferson comes to appreciate it because he grows to love the man. They have a great relationship at the outset because they're both radicals. But what cements the friendship is their experience abroad in the 1780s when Jefferson, the widower, is a minister. Both of them are ministers in France at first, and then later when Adams goes to London as minister to Great Britain, Jefferson remains in Paris as minister to France, but they go back and forth. Actually, Jefferson visits Adams in London, and he gets along with Abigail. Actually, Jefferson becomes a member of the family, and takes John Quincy, Adams's eldest son, to a museum or to a symphony. The families mingle, and Jefferson actually flirts a little with Abigail. There's a wonderful little account where he writes a letter. He says, "I was going to buy a statue of Venus for your dining room, but then I realized having two such Venuses in the dining room would be too much." I mean, that's Jefferson's attempt at
well, that's Jefferson's courtesy, and
right.
and that's his politesse.
Right. He's the Enlightenment was very obsessed by civility and politeness. And Jefferson takes it very seriously and lectures his sons-in-law about the importance of politeness. That is, not saying what you think, taking into account the feelings of other people. And, of course, Jefferson, in doing that, ends up appearing to be not entirely honest. I mean, one of the sad facts of politeness is that you can end up seeming to be two-faced.
There was never anything two-faced about Adams.
No. He was honest, but honest to the point where he would often say things that he shouldn't have said. He would even, during 1777, even in the Congress, he calls into question the reputation of General Washington, which was sacred to many people. He had that kind of... But people respected him because he was such an advocate for independence. He lives off that reputation, and that's why he does attain the positions he has, because of his leadership in probably nobody in the Congress was more important in driving the Congress towards independence than Adams. In other ways, they're also different. Of course, they're different in their political attitudes. In fact, I can't think of any major issue, with the exception of the desire for independence, in which they differed. They differed over human nature, over the nature of America.
Well, let's talk about a little bit about those things. How do they differ about human nature?
Well, Jefferson's a radical, of 18th century type radical. He was optimistic about people. He thought they were basically sociable and willing to love other people. All you had to do is get the interfering monarchical government out of the way and let the free flow of affection tie you to other people. That's the radical position. By William Godwin in England is a radical and often called the founder of anarchism. Well, he's part of that whole crowd of Paine and Godwin, and Jefferson is right in that group. He's not as radical as Godwin, but that's the kind of radicalism that separates the liberal of the 18th century from the liberal of today. Adams, on the other hand, is doubtful about human nature. He's pessimistic about the future. He has a sour and cynical view. He's a conservative, but not a Ronald Reagan type conservative. He has a cynical view of human nature. People are not nice, and he has none of the confidence that Jefferson has in the future. Jefferson is the pure American innocent. He thinks everything is going to work out, and he's often surprised by the world when it doesn't work out that way. Adams is sure that things aren't going to work out. He's pessimistic about what's going to happen. The biggest difference, I suppose, is that Jefferson is the founder, really, or the creator of American exceptionalism, that we are a special nation, that we have a special responsibility to bring republicanism, or what we would call democracy, to the world. And we're different from other nations. He creates American exceptionalism. Adams over and over again says, we're not an exceptional nation. We're just as corrupt, just as sinful, just as messy as any other nation. And there's no special providence for the United States, says Adams. So they couldn't differ more on the basic myths and dreams of what it is to be an American.
And what about their attitudes toward wealth and toward money? I mean, I think you say somewhere in the book that Jefferson is fears monarchy, and Adams fears oligarchy.
He puts it to Jefferson at one point. He says, "You, Mr. Jefferson, you fear the one, I fear the few, the aristocracy." And he believes, of course, in the natural inequality of society. There'll always be an oligarchy, and that oligarchy will not be the most talented people, even under an electoral system. He does not believe the electorate will pick out the wisest and the most talented or the most virtuous leaders. They're apt to get the richest or the wiliest, the schemers elected. So he has great doubts about democracy. He takes on every American dream in one way or another, which are really created by Jefferson, who is the exponent of Americanism. On the view of equality, this is where I think it's a crucial moment, and one of the things that I found most interesting in investigating the book, to realize that Jefferson, when he said all men are created equal, he meant it literally. And I think it's widely shared by his colleagues, enlightened colleagues. This is the Lockean view that you start with a blank sheet, a blank slate, which is etched and by experience, so that the differences between people that we quite recognize as adults, that they are different because of the environment. In other words, Jefferson believes in nurture, not nature, and that's why he's obsessed by education. Adams is the opposite. He says we're born unequal right from birth, and those differences will stay with us through our lives. He tells Jefferson later in a letter, I visited a foundling hospital in Paris, and I saw babies 4 days old. He said, 4 days. And he says, already, some were ugly, some were beautiful. Some were smart, others were stupid. He says they're right there at the beginning, and there's not much education can do about it. Well, that's not an American view, and I think we have stayed quite rightly with the Jeffersonian premise. Even though we have a lot of talk of genetics and DNA, of course, Adams knew nothing of that, but we are still on the Jefferson. We still accept the Jeffersonian premise. That's why we spend so much of our energy and funds promoting education, because we believe deeply that we have the possibility of changing people in the course of their lives. And this is what separates these two men, a fundamental difference of human nature.
How does Jefferson square the notion of all men being equal with his ownership of many hundreds of slaves?
He accepts the black Africans, and that from his premise. Not all of his colleagues did. Many people felt that black Africans were different because of the African sun. It had scorched their skin, and there is the feeling that if they live in a temperate climate for enough time, and not necessarily one lifetime, that they will gradually whiten. That is a view widely accepted by enlightened people in America. Again, going back to what we might call the environment, the nurturing, rather than nature. Jefferson is an exception in that respect, but his view of equality is actually widely accepted by others, even slaveholders, in a way that he does not buy into that. So he makes an exception to his own view.
They have a falling out in the 1790s.
Right.
I mean, and the falling out comes out of their different attitudes toward the French Revolution.
Exactly. Jefferson is a true believer. He's an ideologue. Nobody in the country is more committed to the French Revolution. He and Thomas Paine, in their attitudes, in their ideas, are indistinguishable from one another. He's so much of a believer that in 1793, during the Terror in France, his successor writes to him and says, "Mr. Jefferson, many of your friends, your aristocratic friends, are being guillotined by the thousands in Paris." And Jefferson writes this extraordinary letter back where he says, "Well, so be it, but if only an Adam and Eve are left alive and left free, it will be worth it." Well, that statement...
that's like Lenin.
Well, it's Connor Cruz O'Brien, who, the Irish journalist and historian, wrote a book about the 1790s and came across that letter, and he was appalled, and he said, well, this makes Jefferson the Pot Paul of the 18th century. Pot Paul, of course, being the Cambodian communist leader who was willing to sacrifice millions of his own people for the sake of the cause. And Jefferson, whether he would have done that, in fact, of course, is another thing. Madison always dismissed these kinds of remarks as part of Jefferson's rhetorical overkill. But that's how he felt about it. He was really not upset by the amount of deaths that were occurring during the Terror, because he is a true believer, and he's as radical an 18th century liberal as you could be, I think, in America, and still be an elected official. So I find no difference between his ideas and Thomas Paine's. Paine simply says publicly what he believes. Jefferson holds back, particularly on religion. He believes the same as Paine does, that Christianity is something of a joke, a kind of absurdity. The Trinity is hocus pocus, all of that, he says privately. He makes a couple of mistakes publicly in his notes on Virginia, talking about religion. What does it matter if my neighbor believes in one God or no God? It doesn't hurt me, it doesn't break my arm. Well, that got him into a lot of trouble, just that simple statement. And then in his opening paragraph, a preamble to his bill for religious freedom that eventually passed in Virginia in the 1780s, he makes the statement that our religious opinions, and he says opinions, not even faith, our religious opinions have no more importance to our civic life than our opinions of physics and geometry. Well, that's just not acceptable to most Americans in the 18th century, nor is it acceptable to Americans today. So, but that comes back to haunt him and gets him accused of being an atheist, which he was not. And he's very much on the defensive about his views of Christianity, which is why he concocts his book, his little his Jesus book, cutting out all the references to loving thy neighbor, loving thyself, which he did believe. And he says, well, that's the true Christianity. But he denies all of the miracles and all of the divinity of Christ, which Adams did too. But Adams never mocks religion as such.
No, he takes religion seriously.
Quite seriously, exactly, and has respect for all religions, even though he himself is a Unitarian. That is to say, he believes that Jesus was a great man, but not a divine figure. But he certainly does not mock organized religion in the way Jefferson does.
Talk about the division between Federalist and Republican in the 1790s.
Right. Well, Adams is the one thing the two men do have in common, in addition to their support of the Revolution, is their deep and abiding hatred of Alexander Hamilton, both of them. Adams is a Federalist that is a believer in law and order and hierarchy and stability, but he's not a Hamiltonian-type Federalist. Hamilton is really out to create a fiscal military government in the United States in emulation of Great Britain with its banking system and its funding system, to create the United States to be a European-type state that could take on the Europeans, any of the France or Britain, on their own terms. It might take 4 or 5 decades, but that's Hamilton's vision. He wants to build a European-type state with a large standing army, a navy, and all of the bureaucracy that goes into being a great power. That, of course, is not Jefferson at all. Jefferson wants an agrarian-dominated state without a powerful government and no standing army, certainly no standing army, and wants to avoid all of the instruments of coercion, of power. He's a real libertarian in that sense. Adams is somewhat between them in a way, between Hamilton on one end, although he's a Federalist, and Jefferson on the other. So they differ politically. He is, of course, elected president. He's vice president in 1789, Adams, and expects to follow, and he does follow Washington as president, although he wins the 1796 election by only 3 electoral votes. And in those days, the man who gets the second most number of electoral votes is elected vice president. Of course, that's Jefferson. So you have the awkward situation of the man who's president, identified as a Federalist. Jefferson has already emerged as the leader of this new Republican opposition. It's kind of awkward at the outset. Jefferson is the Secretary of State in the Washington administration and is at the same time emerging as a leader of the opposition. That tension, that absurdity, if you will, gets so bad that he finally has to resign from his office. And he becomes the leader of the opposition and is the vice president under Adams. Adams assumes that he's going to be reelected, as Washington was, to a second term. And so he's terribly humiliated by his defeat in 1800, which was one of the most vicious and scurrilous elections in our history, probably the worst in our history.
Yeah, much worse than what
we're going through
now.
Today. Oh, the things said about Now, the two men don't campaign, so they don't say anything publicly about one another, which, of course, is important for their reconciliation, but their followers do. Accusing them of everything. Jefferson's an atheist and Adams is a monarchist. There's some justification for each of those charges, although Jefferson's certainly not an atheist, but they correctly realized that he did not like organized religion. And in Adams's case, he was writing things at the outset of the 90s in attacking the French Revolution, saying that our government if it becomes so corrupt, the elections are becoming so corrupt, so faction-ridden, that we sooner or later are going to have to go to a hereditary president and a hereditary Senate. Well, that particular essay, which came out in 1791, is appalls Jefferson and is part of the split that occurs. No one quite knows what to do about Adams because he seems to be supporting the English monarchy, which he does believe is a great the Constitution, the English Constitution, and he does really want the United States to emulate it as much as possible. He wants
an upper house representing wealth and a lower house representing the common people.
And because England has a House of Commons, he continues to call England a republic, even though it has a hereditary monarch, which his colleagues, his fellow citizens, find confusing. But Adams's peculiar view is that as long as you have a House of Commons, that is a lower house which is representative of the people, then you're a republic. And he thinks that America will have to go the way of the English monarchy with a hereditary Senate and a hereditary president. Well, though that's so frightening to Jefferson and his fellow Republicans that aggravates the split between the two men. In addition to the split over the French Revolution, Adams is very much, in fact, very much a Burkean. He thinks Burke is wonderful. And of course, Paine and Burke are at odds, and so they're the American counterparts of Jefferson and Adams.
There are riots in the streets in the late 1790s.
The 1798 is as critical a period in our history, as close to a civil war we came until the actual Civil War of 1861. People don't appreciate how serious that was. There's a threat of a French invasion, which, of course, since it didn't happen, historians haven't taken seriously. The only comparable period, I think, in our history of fear of that sort is early 1942, where we were frightened of a Japanese invasion, which led to us rounding up over 100,000 people of Japanese descent, many of whom were American citizens, and putting them in concentration camps, something that we've just never forgiven ourselves for. But it helps explain the fear that we had at the time, and it was signed off by Earl Warren and FDR as well. You need to get back to that period of early 1942 to appreciate the fears that people had. Since there was no Japanese invasion, the whole thing seems regrettable and a mistake. The same thing happened in 1798, but the fear was real. Napoleon was invading European countries, Holland and Italy and Germany, and creating puppet regimes, French puppet regimes. And the feeling was that they're going to come to America, and they've got a fifth column here of many, many Republicans who will support this French puppet regime. 10% of the population of Philadelphia at the time was French, made up of refugees from the terror, and there was a sense of Frenchness everywhere and frightening. And this helps explain the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, of course, have stained the Federalist reputation ever since. But you need a context to understanding why they did that. Adams favored it. Abigail was even more in favor of the Alien and Sedition Acts than John, but he signed off on them, and of course that has always been a taint on his reputation. But one needs to recover that. There was terror in the streets. Adams talks about it and tells Jefferson about it in their later letters, trying to remind him of how scary things were in 1798.
Well, in Philadelphia, people were throwing rocks at each other.
That's right.
I mean, and the
mobs were.
Mobs.
He feared for his life. His servants had guns ready to keep the mob from breaking down the door. That's the kind of feeling it was. So it was a frightening moment that we need to recover if we're going to understand actions like the Alien and Sedition Acts.
All right. Adams feels so humiliated by the loss of the election of 1800 that he doesn't stay in Washington for Jefferson's inauguration.
That's right. I mean, the only president, the only man who's ever done that, not stay for the inauguration of his successor. He gets a 4 a.m. stage back to Quincy as fast as he could to avoid the humiliation of having to witness his successor's inauguration.
Jefferson then now becomes president for 8 years.
Right.
And much of his policy, if I'm not mistaken, is really along. He borrows it from the Federalists.
Well, not really. I think the one thing he keeps is the bank, which he has to. It's a chartered bank. It's got a 20-year charter. And the Republicans work to destroy that, and they don't renew the charter because that expires in 1810. Jefferson's no longer in office, but Madison lets it expire, despite the advice of Gallatin, who thinks the bank is actually probably a pretty good idea. But they're ideologues. So he destroys he reduces the army to 3,000 men. I mean, for a continental-sized government, 3,000 men is no army at all. He cuts back he thinks that the Federalists had exaggerated the bureaucracy. I mean, when you look at the War Department, it's got a secretary and a couple of aides and 3 secretaries. I mean, 3 aides. I mean, this is just ridiculous. This is the Pentagon. And he thinks that's overblown. The Federalists have expanded offices. So he cuts the civil service and cuts back on taxation. If you lived under Jefferson's administration, you wouldn't know there was a national government except for the delivery of the mail, which is still a federal responsibility. Otherwise, how would you know that you had a federal government? Whatever taxes are tariffs on certain goods coming in, which are paid at the border, and you wouldn't know that you were experiencing a federal government. There's no taxation of any sort that would touch you. So this is a government that scarcely exists in the minds of people, and that's what Jefferson wanted. He, in fact, wants to go back. He tries to go back as much as he can to what were the Articles of Confederation, which presumably had been scrapped in 1787. Jefferson really believes that most affairs of life should be handled by the states and not the national government. So he's an extreme anti-federalist, you might say, and tries to implement that. And he's frightened to death of war, like all radicals. He feels war breeds monarchy. There's some truth to that when you think about how all of our wars, every one of them has enhanced the executive powers, with the exception of Madison. That's what's interesting. Madison fought the War of 1812, and of course it was an utter failure. But it was self-consciously a failure because Madison said, I am not going to enhance the power of the presidency simply because it will have bad repercussions for republicanism. He's willing to suffer the humiliations of the losses that we had in our fighting the British in the War of 1812. So that, with that exception, every other war has enhanced the power of the presidency. And so Jefferson's view, which is quite the common radical view, that monarchs benefit from war, and that's how they've enhanced their power. So that's why Jefferson goes to extreme lengths to use any alternative to military force, which is his economic sanctions or his embargo, which is withholding of trade, which we still see as a means of avoiding the use of military force.
Jefferson's ideas about the least government possible are still very much current.
Of course, but the reversal, of course, Jefferson's supposed to be the founder of the Democratic Party. Well, the Democratic Party is a different kind of view now about government. The liberal position in the 18th century was minimal government, as I say, because of the fear of what governments had created. You see, they had inherited a position where monarchs had created distinctions, inequalities. They'd given out titles. They'd given out monopolies. So it's natural for a radical who's opposed to monarchy to be small government, minimal government.
Right.
We live in a different world as a product from the late 19th century on. That's been reversed. So the liberal position now is to use government to bring about equality and a less hierarchical society.
All right, talk now about what you call the reconciliation. I mean, after the election of 1800, Adams and Jefferson don't speak to each other.
Right, for 12 years.
For 12 years.
They just not communicating. There is I could mention what happened in 1804. Abigail, who had been very close to Jefferson and really admired him. She says at one point, in the 1780s, he's a choice sort of man, really a great man. She writes a letter of condolence to him because she learns of the death of his younger daughter, whom Abigail had known and had actually hosted briefly in London when she arrived from Virginia before Jefferson could pick her up. She writes this letter of condolence and expresses her sorrow, partly because she had just lost a son, an older son, 30 years old, who had died of alcoholism. And Jefferson responds warmly, and maybe that could have developed, but he makes a mistake. He says there's only one thing that irritated me. Your husband and I really agree on everything, and there's only one thing that I found objectionable about his administration, and that was his appointment of the midnight judges. Those appointments made between the election of November, which Adams had lost. And, of course, in those days, the inauguration of the president doesn't take place till March, so there's a good 5 months of time. And the Federalists not only passed legislation, but created 16 different judgeships, and Adams appointed men to these positions. And this, he says, was a mistake. Well, Abigail comes back harshly and defends Adams, and she's really angry. Jefferson then tries to respond, and the next thing you know, she's back with another charge. And Jefferson must have wondered, what have I got myself into? And he drops it. And then the man who really makes possible the reconciliation is Dr. Benjamin Rush, who is a very important figure in the founding, a kind of second-level founder, is friendly with both men, but mostly with Adams. And he works for 2 years to bring these two men together because he feels the country, posterity, needs their thoughts of these two great patriots, and he wants to reconcile them. And he works very nicely back and forth, telling each of them that the other one loves them, and that's enough finally. But it takes 2 years. That's how bitter they are. In fact, when Jefferson finally says, all right, I'll agree to write him, but let's just keep Mrs. Adams out of it because she and I just don't agree at all. He remembers how he was burned in 1804. And so they start, and they have 150, I think it's 158 letters, with Adams writing 3 to every one of Jefferson's. But that becomes understandable because at one point, Adams, he realizes that he's in a different league of celebrity, status, if you will. He's in a different celebrity status. He says to Jefferson, how many letters a year do you get from your correspondence? And Jefferson says, well, I get 2,000 and something. And Adams is shocked. He says, because he only gets 200 and something. Well, that
Okay.
A tenth. I mean, we have to understand that Jefferson is a darling of the Enlightenment. He is a Platonic figure, an enlightened ruler of this new Republican world across the Atlantic. And he's writing to Europeans. Alexander Humboldt, the great naturalist, is exchanging letters and visits Jefferson in his presidency and exchanges letters with him. He's writing to the Tsar of Russia. I mean, Adams is not in that league. He's not dealing with those kinds of people, and he knows it. And he knows that he's just never going to have that kind of status through the rest of eternity, he predicts. So that's he says to Jefferson, don't worry about it. I love writing, and he does. He explodes. But he's sassy and facetious and joking. I mean, at one point, to give you an idea of how he would treat Jefferson, this is 1815. Napoleon's been defeated. The Bourbons are back in the throne of France. And Adams says to Jefferson, so what do you think of the French Revolution now, Mr. Jefferson? I mean, any other person might have said, well, that's enough. I'm not putting up with that. But Jefferson's politeness, his willingness to put up with this kind of razzing, and his really, I think, deep love for Adams, knowing that the man is really beneath this crusty surface is an amiable person. He just lets those kinds of things slide. And that enables the correspondence to go on. It's a kind of superficial correspondence because they avoid really sensitive subjects.
Well,
like
they don't
slavery.
talk about slavery.
Well, there's a little bit of talk when in 1819, they can't avoid it over the Missouri crisis. But Adams is, for the first time, I think, is sensitive. He knows this is not an issue to push at Jefferson. And he more or less takes the view. He says himself, I'm not a slaveholder. I never have owned slaves, and I'm opposed to it. But he says to Jefferson, look, you guys, meaning you planters, have got this problem. And they know it's a problem. They talk about this. If anything breaks the Union up, it'll be this, slavery. So they're already aware of how dangerous this is. And Adams says to him, look, you guys got this problem. I'm going to let you handle it. You and you fellow planters handle it. He's not going to be an advocate for abolition. He's not going to come out in the way his son did, of course, later in the Congress.
But also Adams thinks that the idea of an American republic is going to be overwhelmed by ambition and vanity and greed and money.
Right. They're pessimistic. Actually, both of them are pretty pessimistic about the future because they have all of these banks being created with paper money everywhere, and it's scary and frightening since neither of them understood what a bank was. I mean, Adams says at one point, any bank that issues more paper than it has gold and silver in the vaults to cover is a cheat upon somebody. Well, no bank could operate without extending more paper. Now, some of them went wild. I mean, one in my own state of Rhode Island, Gloucester, Rhode Island, had something like $600,000 plus out in paper, which says, we, the Bank of Gloucester, promise to pay the bearer on demand, and so on. Well, they only had $86 in the bank in gold and silver to cover that, and this is the first bank that fails in American history. That was frightening to people. But those bank bills, that currency is really fundamental to the economy. It's capital, and it helps explain why the American economy becomes so successful. The founders were frightened of paper money, so they forbid the states from printing paper money. That was one of the reasons why Madison, in his Virginia plan, wanted the Congress to have a negative over all state legislation. Every bill would presumably have to come to the Congress to be okayed. He was frightened, particularly of paper money, because it creates inflation, was hurting gentry creditors. Well, that was too impractical. And the convention ended up having Article 1, Section 10, which forbids the states from doing certain things. They can't pass tariffs, and they can't print money. That's probably a good thing. But the economy would have been stifled if that had been rigidly enforced. So what the states do is charter banks, which in turn printed the money.
Right.
And so you have millions of dollars. I think on the eve of the Civil War, 10,000 different bills are circulating around. It was crazy, but it was fundamental. It's capital.
Right.
That people are they're using it. And of course, Jefferson and Adams don't understand this. Even Hamilton, who did understand banks, was bewildered by the number. And he died in 1804. He was bewildered already by the number of banks that were creating all this paper. That is not what he wanted. He wanted his Bank of the United States to monopolize banking.
Right. Yeah.
And so this is a crazy world that's emerging. And all of those founders who lived into this democratic, crazy economy were disillusioned with what they had wrought. This is not the kind of country they wanted. It's much too democratic, much too wild, and was unanticipated.
I mean, it's what we've got today.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And they both foresee this.
Yes. Although I would say that the antebellum period is a little wilder than today. The federal government now has a monopoly of the money, and that's what happens after the Civil War. The federal government comes in and taxes all of these state banks out of business and monopolizes greenbacks. We don't have any state banks issuing money anymore.
Right.
That's really one of the fundamental changes that's not as much emphasized as it should be that occurs with the Civil War. And counterfeiting dies. Counterfeiting flourished in the antebellum period because they couldn't have enough paper money. They were even able they were even willing, users, entrepreneurs, business people were willing to have counterfeit money as long as people accepted it.
Right.
And they would close their eyes and wink and let it go, which goes to show you that, the Bitcoin shows that anything can be money if people will accept it, allow it to pass.
Well, all right. So Jefferson survives. I mean,
right.
Hamilton, and he does. I mean, his notions of American exceptionalism and American virtue.
Right, and American equality.
And American equality.
Lincoln is really the man who, as you know, in 1858, says all honor. He uses Jefferson. All honor to Mr. Jefferson. And what's extraordinary in those speeches that Lincoln gave on the eve of the war is his realization of how diverse America had become. And of course, nothing like the diversity of today, but for him, it was, and you can imagine the idea of a nation means a tribe, a single ethnicity. And here's this United States with, as Lincoln says, we've got Frenchmen, we've got Spaniards, we've got Germans, we've got Irish, we've got all these different Scots. How are we going to hold together? We're not a nation. And that's a concern that people have increasingly through the period, the antebellum period. And Lincoln says, well, we have an answer to that. And it's that good old Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And he says, and this is true for all men in all times. And then he says, all these immigrants who came here have a bond with the founders. And then he goes on with an image which I find still startling. He says, as if they are flesh of the flesh and blood of the founders. Well, that's just an extraordinary statement which helps explain why these founders still have some meaning for us. He's saying that declaration that they created, that Declaration of Independence, is what gives them a kind of blood relationship to everybody who comes after, even if they have no actual blood relationship with the people. And therefore, a nation like ours, which is not really a nation, can be held together as a single people, as one people, and that the Declaration promises. So it's an extraordinary moment, and from that moment, Jefferson ascends to a kind of dominance that transcends his own weakness and his own failings and particularly his racist views, that to give him a kind of immortality for the country that I think continues to live. Now, who knows what historians will do with Jefferson, because he is tainted by his slaveholding, and in addition by his quite explicit racist views made in the one book he wrote, Notes on the State of Virginia. But it's Lincoln, I think, who makes Jefferson a hero, and then of course FDR building that memorial on the tidal basin. I mean, there's no such memorial to Adams. I mean, this is a huge memorial right off the mall. There's nothing like that for poor John Adams, and he knows, he understands. I think that his views are simply not capable of sustaining a nation. You can't have a guy who's cynical and denies the exceptional nature of your country to be the spokesman for your nation.
But today, I mean, the Jefferson idea and the Lincoln idea seems to be under a good deal of stress.
Oh, definitely. But there's no alternative. If we repudiate Jefferson, then what are we left with? What have we got? We have to really, because we're not a nation in any ethnic sense, we don't have a national. We're better equipped because of that, better equipped to handle immigrants. And we got everybody in the world is here, and we somehow are holding together better than some of the existing nations in Europe that are basically ethnically based. The French really can't believe that all those Arabs who had lived in France for 4 generations are really French. Anybody who's lived in 4 generations in our country, wherever they came from, is an American. They can't accept that because they still have a kind of ethnic base to their Frenchness. And we don't have an ethnic base. There's no such thing as an American. And, as I say, to be an American is not to be somebody, but to believe in something. And what do we believe in? We believe in what the founders said and what Jefferson said. All men are created equal.
That is why your book is so good.
Well, thank you.
Because it brings into the present the meaning of the past, which is still with us.
That was Gordon S. Wood speaking with Louis Lapham in 2017 about Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. On our website, as companion to this episode, we've published an essay adapted from the foreword that Wood wrote for Ted Widmer's new book, The Living Declaration, a biography of America's founding text. Of Wood, his teacher, collaborator, and friend, Ted Widmer, in a tribute published on the Library of America website, recently wrote, "He was an Argonaut," as Jefferson phrased it in a late letter to Adams, and his lifelong journey brought light to all of us. You can find a link to Gordon S. Wood's essay in our show notes, but with the permission of the Library of America, I'm sharing here an audio version of the essay, titled, "As Though They Were Blood of the Blood, Jefferson's Declaration and the Problem of American Identity," by Gordon S. Wood. To be an American is not to be someone, but to believe in something. And the something that Americans most readily believe in can be found in the Declaration of Independence. By itself, it makes the United States a nation. The U.S. has not been a nation in any traditional meaning of the term. That is, a political body composed of a people with common ancestry or cultural heritage. There is no American ethnicity that corresponds to the state called the United States. And there was no such distinctive ethnicity even in 1776, when the U.S. was created. Although the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence holds out the promise of Americans becoming one people, at the end of the text, the members of the Continental Congress could only mutually pledge to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. There was nothing else but themselves they could dedicate themselves to. No patria, no fatherland, no nation as yet. Even at the time of the founding, America already had a diverse society. In addition to 700,000 people of African descent and tens of thousands of native Indians, nearly all the peoples of Western Europe were represented in the country. In the census of 1790, only 60% of the white population of well over 3 million could claim English ancestry. The rest were composed of a variety of ethnicities: Germans, Scots, Irish, Scotch-Irish, Dutch, and several others. For 18th century Enlightened reformers, ethnic diversity and multiculturalism were not good things. The revolutionary leaders' idea of a modern nation, shared by enlightened British, French, and German 18th century thinkers as well, was one that, as David Ramsay said, was composed of a homogeneous people, a society that was not broken up by differences of dialects, ethnicity, religion, and local customs. Thus, many of the revolutionary leaders were desperate to think of themselves as a homogeneous people. John Jay lived in New York, the most diverse city in the country, and was himself 3/8 French and 5/8 Dutch, with no English ancestry whatsoever. Nevertheless, in Federalist No. 2, Jay had the nerve to declare that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, and very similar in their manners and customs. Jay's statement was based on hope, not reality. Many other revolutionary leaders had little of his confidence in America's homogeneity and instead wondered whether America could ever be a real, honest-to-goodness nation. John Adams certainly had his doubts. In America, he said, there was nothing like the patria of the Romans, the fatherland of the Dutch, or the patrie of the French. All he could see was an appalling diversity of religious denominations and ethnicities. At one point, he counted at least 20 different religious sects in the U.S. We are such a hodgepodge of people, he concluded, such an omnium gatherum of English, Irish, German, Dutch, Swedes, French, etc., that it is difficult to give a name to the country characteristic of the people. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, the rematch with Great Britain that some Americans called the Second War of Independence, Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, himself a Swiss immigrant, thought that the people had become more American. They feel and act more as a nation, and I hope that the permanency of the Union is thereby better secured. The war had the effect of diminishing the country's sense of being English. The war tied Englishness exclusively to a Federalist party that was on its last legs and about to disappear. Yet immigration from Europe continued, and the country was even more ethnically diverse and farther away than ever from being a traditional nation. Hezekiah Niles, the most important journalist of the early 19th century, saw the problem and offered a new solution to the establishing of national character for Americans. Despite the victory over Britain in the War of 1812, Niles knew that eliminating the old English habits of mind would never be enough to make America a real nation. If we were to have a new nation, Niles declared in a public appeal in 1817 addressed to the two former Republican presidents, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, we needed new principles, new ideas, new ways of thinking. We seek a new revolution, he said, not less important, perhaps, in its consequences than that of 1776, a revolution in letters, a shaking off of the fetters of the mind. To do this, he said, we should begin with the establishment of first principles that were close at hand in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Thus, the Declaration, said Niles, shall be the base of all the rest, the common reference in cases of doubt and difficulty. It was Abraham Lincoln who decisively developed Niles's insight and argued for the unifying importance of the Revolution and the founders to all Americans. When Lincoln declared in 1859 all honor to Jefferson, he paid homage to the founder who he knew could explain why the U.S. was one nation and why it should remain so. Half the American people, said Lincoln, had no direct blood connection to the revolutionaries of 1776. These German, Irish, French, and Scandinavian citizens either had come from Europe themselves or their ancestors had, and they had settled in America, finding themselves our equals in all things. Although these immigrants may have had no actual connection in blood with the revolutionary generation that could make them feel part of the rest of the nation, they had, said Lincoln, that old Declaration of Independence, with its expression of the moral principle of equality to draw upon. This principle, which was applicable to all men and all times, made all these different peoples one with the founders, as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. This emphasis on liberty and equality, Lincoln said, shifting images, was the electric cord that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. In Jefferson's Declaration, Lincoln found a solution to the great problem of American identity. How the great variety of individuals in America, with all their diverse ethnicities, races, and religions, could be brought together into a single nation. As Lincoln grasped better than anyone ever has, the Revolution and its Declaration of Independence offered us a set of beliefs that through the generations has supplied a bond that holds together the most diverse nation that history has ever known. Since now the whole world is in the U.S., nothing but the ideals coming out of the Revolution and their subsequent rich and contentious history can turn such an assortment of different individuals into the one people the Declaration says we are. That is why the Declaration of Independence is the most important document in American history. As though they were blood of the blood, Jefferson's Declaration and the Problem of American Identity by Gordon S. Wood is adapted from the foreword that Wood wrote for Ted Widmer's new book, The Living Declaration, a biography of America's founding text, published by the Library of America. In upcoming episodes, you'll hear the voices of William Hoagland, Joseph J. Ellis, Andrew Delbanco, and others. And later in July, while sticking to the Revolutionary period, we will be detouring across the Atlantic with Andrea Wolf, author most recently of The Traveler, one man's quest for humanity from the South Seas to revolutionary Paris. The man whose quest Wolf's new book narrates, George Forster, a naturalist who sailed with Captain Cook and later became an ardent supporter of the French Revolution, whom Friedrich Engels dubbed the German Thomas Paine. To support Lapham's Quarterly, consider making a donation, purchasing a back issue, or subscribing to the Lapham's Quarterly Substack. I'm Donovan Hone for Lapham's Quarterly. This episode of The World in Time was produced with help from Peter Ojero. Special thanks to Grace Andreessen, Joe Sisak, Jamie Fuller, Apurva Tadapalli, Lee Froelich, Jason Brown, and Christo Hayes. Lapham's Quarterly brings voices from the past up to the microphone of the present. Back issues are available for purchase on our website. Visit laphamsquarterly.org for more details.
For a small business owner, every day is full of surprises. Some great, some not so great. Like when a client cancels their order at the last minute. But here's a surprise you will like. Progressive provides small business owners with 30 customizable coverage options to help keep their business going strong. So go ahead, surprise yourself. Get a quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates and third-party insurers. Coverage is not available in all states or for all vehicles and coverage selections.